Michael Riker was the kind of man you'd pass on the street without a second glance. Quiet, unremarkable, forgettable. But behind that blank stare was a calculating killer who hunted for sport, not out of rage, but for the rush. Jessica Marsh was the one who lived to tell the tale, the only survivor of a man later unmasked as one of the most sadistic, thrill-seeking psychopaths Los Angeles had ever known. This is the chilling true story of a predator who turned murder into ritual, and the woman who finally stopped him. In the late 1990s, Los Angeles was a city that shimmered with fame and ambition. Bright lights and palm trees lined the streets, and dreams were built on casting calls and chance encounters. But beneath the surface of Hollywood's promise was something far more sinister, a quiet, methodical predator hiding in plain sight. His name was Michael Riker, and for years no one suspected what he was capable of. Riker moved through the city unnoticed. He wasn't famous, wealthy, or connected. In fact, he lived a fairly ordinary life. He worked odd jobs in construction, occasionally fixed appliances, and rarely stood out. His neighbors described him as polite but distant. He rarely made eye contact, never invited people over, and often left for long drives at night. He had mastered the art of blending in. No one knew that behind his blank expression was a mind consumed by violent fantasies. The first confirmed. Murder occurred in the fall of 1998. Lauren Diaz, a 22-year-old aspiring actress, had moved to Los Angeles from Phoenix just 6 months earlier. She rented a small apartment in Burbank, worked as a waitress, and spent her evenings auditioning for commercials and student films. On a Sunday morning, her landlord noticed her mailbox was overflowing. After multiple unanswered knocks, police were called to conduct a welfare check. What they found shocked even seasoned officers. Lauren was found in her bedroom, stabbed more than 30 times. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no murder weapon. It looked like a crime of passion. Investigators initially assumed it was someone she knew, perhaps an ex-boyfriend or a jealous acquaintance. The brutality suggested rage, but the truth was far more chilling. Michael Riker had been watching her. He had followed her from work, noted her schedule, and waited for the perfect night to strike. He entered her apartment through an unlocked window, struck quickly, and vanished before dawn. What set this murder apart wasn't just the violence, it was the complete lack of leads. Riker left no trace behind. He didn't take anything, he didn't speak to his victim. He didn't make a sound that neighbors could report. It was a perfect kill, at least in his mind, and it wouldn't be his last. In the following months, no one made the connection between Lauren's murder and other similar crimes. The city was sprawling, the victims didn't appear related, and police departments didn't communicate effectively across jurisdictions. Riker used that to his advantage. He moved apartments frequently, sometimes staying in motels, always on the lookout for his next target. His criteria were simple: young women who lived alone, preferably near where he worked or once lived. He observed from a distance, often for weeks. Then he struck with a level of violence that made it clear this wasn't just about murder. This was about dominance and control. By the time detectives began to whisper about a potential serial killer, Riker had already vanished into the crowd again. He walked the same streets as his victims, rode the same buses, and shopped at the same stores. No one noticed the monster among them. He was, to everyone else, just another face in Hollywood. The killings didn't stop with Lauren Diaz. Over the next several years, Los Angeles saw a string of similarly gruesome murders, but they were spread out across different neighborhoods: Studio City, West Hollywood, Sherman Oaks. Each time, the victim was a young woman living alone. Each time, there were no signs of forced entry. The attacks always happened late at night, and each body was left brutally mutilated, often stabbed dozens of times. The savagery was unmistakable. Yet, without clear links between the victims, the police treated the cases as isolated incidents. They were missing the pattern that tied them all together: Michael Riker. Riker knew what he was doing. He had no interest in random violence. Everything was planned. He stalked his victims for weeks, sometimes even months. He learned when they left for work, when they got home, when they turned their lights off. He memorized their routines with quiet precision. Then he waited for the right night. A night when they were most vulnerable. A night when no one would suspect a thing. He wore gloves, used a knife he later disposed of, and never took anything from the scene that could be traced. His movements were calculated. He parked blocks away and never struck in the same place twice. The rage in his attacks was always masked by the cold logic of his planning. To the outside world, these were crimes of passion. To Riker, they were trophies, meticulously executed performances where he had full control over life and death. The media began to report on the rising number of unsolved murders of young women in the LA area. Murmurs of a serial killer began to surface, but the LAPD publicly denied any connections. Behind closed doors, some detectives weren't so sure. The similarities in the wounds, the victim profiles, and the lack of evidence were impossible to ignore. Still, without a suspect or a clear motive, the investigation stalled. The cases became cold. Families were left grieving without answers, and Riker disappeared back into obscurity, satisfied that he had escaped once again. What disturbed those who later studied the case was how well Riker fit into society. He wasn't a drifter or an outsider. He paid his rent on time, kept to himself, and never drew suspicion. He worked just enough to get by, often taking temporary jobs in construction or maintenance. His employers never reported any issues. He stayed invisible by being ordinary. That was his greatest weapon. As the years passed, Riker's confidence grew. He began to take greater risks, picking victims closer to his own residence, leaving behind small traces, testing how far he could push without getting caught. He believed he was untouchable, and for a long time he was. Each new killing followed the same violent ritual, yet each one seemed even more frenzied than the last. It was no longer just about the act. It was about the thrill, the risk, the power. Riker wasn't killing to silence a voice or cover up a secret. He was killing because he enjoyed it. And while the city slept, unaware and vulnerable, he prowled through the darkness, always looking for the next victim, always one step ahead. In 2006, the silence broke. After years of speculation, fear, and dead ends, a survivor emerged, a single voice strong enough to crack the facade Michael Riker had built. Her name was Jessica Marsh, a 20-year-old college student living in a quiet Pasadena neighborhood. She was intelligent, ambitious, and completely unaware that she had been marked. Jessica had no idea someone had been watching her for weeks. Riker had parked outside her apartment at odd hours, taken long walks past her windows, and followed her to her evening classes. He studied her like he had done with all his victims. He waited for her to settle into a routine. He looked for signs of vulnerability. An open window, a darkened room, a door left unlocked. When he was certain the time was right, he made his move. It happened just past midnight on a humid summer night. Jessica had fallen asleep after studying late. She had left her window slightly cracked to let in a breeze. Riker slipped in silently, knife in hand, already visualizing what would come next. But this time things didn't go according to plan. As he leaned in to strike, the blade grazed Jessica's skin, and she woke instantly. In a blur of panic and adrenaline, she fought back, scratching, kicking, screaming. Her struggle startled Riker, who hadn't expected resistance. Before he could regain control, she had broken free and bolted out the door, blood streaming from her shoulder. A neighbor heard the commotion and called 911. Police arrived within minutes, but Riker was already gone. What he didn't realize was that in his haste, he had left behind the first major piece of evidence in years, a partial fingerprint on the windowsill. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Detectives processed the print and ran it through multiple databases. Days later, a match came back, Michael Riker. It wasn't a perfect hit, but the print was close enough to warrant a deeper look. When investigators pulled Riker's background, they were stunned. He had lived within walking distance of several prior victims. In every case, he had moved away shortly after the murders. It was no coincidence. Jessica's case triggered a re-examination of unsolved murders from the past decade. Investigators began building a timeline, mapping out Riker's old addresses, cross-referencing with cold case files. The pattern was undeniable. Each time Riker relocated, a murder followed within a few months. He had hidden in plain sight, moving just enough to stay ahead of suspicion. But now, with the fingerprint and Jessica's description, the puzzle pieces were finally falling into place. The survivor's bravery became the turning point. Her account not only saved her own life, but also gave investigators the lead they had desperately needed. For the first time, they had a face to match the horror. Riker's quiet life was about to collapse, and his darkest secrets were coming to light. The man who believed he was untouchable was now being hunted. And for the first time in years, the victims had a voice that refused to be silenced. Following Michael Riker's arrest, authorities began the painstaking process of uncovering the full extent of his crimes. What they found was worse than anyone had imagined. The investigation quickly shifted from a search for a killer to a deep dive into the disturbed mind of a man who had been orchestrating a campaign of terror for over a decade. When police obtained a warrant to search his residence, they expected to find evidence tying him to Jessica Marsh's attack. Instead, they uncovered a hidden world of horror. Tucked away in a rented storage unit registered under a fake name, detectives discovered a chilling collection of personal items, trophies taken from his victims. There were pieces of jewelry, hairbrushes, clothing, even childhood photographs. Each item was carefully stored and labeled. These weren't just souvenirs. They were pieces of lives that had been stolen, reminders Riker kept to relive the murders, long after they were committed. Some items dated back years, linking him to victims that hadn't previously been associated with any known serial killer. The discovery widened the scope of the case. Investigators reopened cold cases from Los Angeles and beyond, comparing crime scene details, forensic evidence, and timelines. What they uncovered shocked even the most experienced detectives. In Illinois, an unsolved murder from 1997 bore striking similarities to Riker's known crimes. A teenage girl named Melissa Avery had been stabbed more than 20 times in her home just outside Chicago. At the time, it was considered a tragic, isolated event. But now, with Riker's travel records placing him in the area that same year, and a necklace found among his possessions matching one Melissa had worn in a school photo, the case was reclassified. As the connections grew, the public's perception of Riker transformed. He wasn't just a local killer who had struck in California. He was a cross-country predator who had used relocation as a means to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. Each move was followed by a violent act. Each new city gave him a fresh pool of victims. He had used job opportunities and low-rent apartments to cover his trail, moving from one state to the next without drawing attention. Experts were brought in to profile him, and what emerged was the portrait of a textbook sadistic psychopath. Riker didn't kill out of desperation or anger. He did it for pleasure. The violence wasn't chaotic, it was controlled, deliberate. He enjoyed the process. The stalking, the breaking in, the moment of domination. His trophies served as a private museum of suffering, something he could revisit whenever he wanted. The media coverage exploded as more victims were identified. Families who had waited years for answers were now getting closure, but the pain was raw. Riker had stolen not just lives, but peace. And the terrifying part was how easily he had gotten away with it for so long. The storage unit was the smoking gun, a vault of memories no one was ever meant to see. It shattered any remaining doubt. Michael Riker wasn't just a killer. He was a collector of pain, a man who turned murder into ritual. And now, finally, the world saw the truth. In 2013, Michael Riker faced trial in one of the most highly publicized court cases in California's history. The courtroom was packed with journalists, victims' families, and curious onlookers, drawn by the horrific details that had emerged during the investigation. Across multiple jurisdictions, he was charged with several counts of first-degree murder and attempted murder, and prosecutors sought the harshest penalty possible. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Trophies from the storage unit, forensic, matches and survivor testimony, but it was Riker's demeanor that disturbed people the most. Throughout the trial, he showed no remorse. He sat stone-faced as photographs of the crime scenes were displayed, as families broke down recalling the last time they spoke to their loved ones. He never flinched at the descriptions of his brutality. Psychologists who examined him described him as a classic psychopath completely devoid of empathy. According to their evaluations, Riker derived satisfaction not only from the act of killing, but from knowing he had manipulated people into seeing him as harmless. It was never just about murder. It was about power, control, and the perverse thrill of getting away with it. Testimony from Jessica Marsh proved to be a defining moment in the trial. Her account was clear, powerful, and harrowing. She described waking to find Riker over her, the struggle, the fear, and the moment she realized she had survived something many others hadn't. Her courage helped solidify the prosecution's case and brought a human face to the list of victims. She wasn't just a name on paper, she was living proof that Riker had made a mistake, and that mistake would cost him everything. When the verdict was read, there was no reaction from Riker. Guilty on all counts. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the sentence was delivered, some families wept quietly. Others simply sat in silence, grappling with a sense of closure that had taken years to arrive. The man who had haunted their lives for so long would never be free again. But even with Riker behind bars, questions remained. How many victims had gone unnoticed? How many families never knew that their loved one had crossed paths with a sadistic killer? Cold case units in multiple states continued to examine unsolved murders for signs of his involvement. Some believed the true number of his victims could be double what had been proven in court. Riker was transferred to a maximum security prison, placed in isolation for his own safety. He remained uncooperative, refusing to answer questions or speak about the murders. He seemed content to keep his secrets, as if withholding the truth was his final act of control. Investigators described him as a man who thrived on silence, his own and that of those he silenced forever. Though justice had been served, the story of Michael Riker was a lasting reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it moves quietly, lives next door, and smiles as it walks by. The Hollywood Ripper was no longer free, but the shadow he cast would remain long. After the cell door slammed shut,